Hi, Dr. Wooler here for Great Plains Lab. This is the monthly installment of Great Plains Laboratory sponsored webinar. We're going to go through, I think it's an interesting topic. This is probably a little bit more of a complicated, one of the more complicated webinars I put together, admittingly. We're going to look at the neurotransmitter section on the organic acids test. As I was putting this together, I realized this particular topic, this lecture that I'm going to do for you, could almost be an entire day seminar. There's that much information that you could potentially go over because there's that many levels. So think of this as sort of the level 1 or level 2 of this discussion, in where this could go from a conversation standpoint, where it could go from a clinical standpoint, how you could relate it to different types of patients' situations, where you could relate it to different types of testing. So interesting stuff. So for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Dr. Kurt Wooler. I've been an integrative and functional medicine physician for over 20 years. I've worked for about that amount of time with the autism community doing biomedical intervention. I do a lot of clinical education for Great Plains Laboratory. In fact, I do their one-day intensive seminar on the implementation of the organic acids test into practice. And I've been doing these monthly webinars now for a number of years. I also speak around the country and internationally as well. I'm also co-founder of Integrative Medicine Academy, which is an online training academy website. We have courses in different topics. I'll talk about those here shortly. And then again, I specialize in individuals with autism, autoimmune, neurological disorders, etc. So the organic acid test, is a very comprehensive profile. It has a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of sections on this particular test. And we're going to delve into, the neurotransmitter section. And the neurotransmitter section is actually broken into two parts. It's got the phenylalanine and tyrosine metabolites, which is linked to dopamine and norepinephrine production, and epinephrine too. And then the tryptophane metabolites, which is linked to serotonin production, but also linked to something called quinolitic acid. We'll talk about that here shortly. So a typical neurotransmitter section that you see on any given organic acid test will usually have certain things that are elevated. Sometimes things are a little bit low. So the Homo Vanillic acid sometimes is high in some people, or we might have a slightly elevated quinolitic acid. I chose this particular one because you very rarely actually see an elevation of the serotonin marker. And this particular one in most tests is actually low. Most people tend to be running deficits in their serotonin, not excess. So it's not uncommon to see it high in people who are either taking certain medication like Prozac or Paxil or Zoloft, a SSRI medication can cause it to be high. Also taking 5-HTP or tryptophane supplementation might also cause it to be elevated. And then there's certain foods. So if you ever see it high, just look in the interpretation section of the OAT. And usually there's certain foods like eggplants and other things that people can eat a lot of that can tend to elevate that marker. So we're going to focus on homovanillic acid, vanillyl acid, and we're going to talk about 5-hydroxyindoleacetic acid, and then I'll, at the end, talk a little bit about quinolitic acid. So one thing to keep in mind, these neurotransmitters don't exist in isolation. Okay, there's an overlap. The body doesn't live in isolation. Every organ system is linked to something else, so there's a lot of communication going on. But when we look at the big three, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, we can see where they each have their own individual components. So for example, serotonin is often linked to sleep, to mood. Dysregulation in serotonin can lead to obsessive compulsive behavior, memory issues. But then there's a crossover, right? Because mood can be regulated by norepinephrine as well as dopamine. Cognitive function can be regulated by dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Attention is often, regulated by dopamine and norepinephrine, and certainly imbalances in dopamine and norepinephrine could affect attention deficit problems. So these, again, there's a dance going on in the brain and nervous system with how some of these neurotransmitters function. So let's focus on the phenylalanine and tyrosine metabolites. And the main one we're looking at is the Vanillic or Vanillic acid, abbreviated HVA. This is a metabolite of dopamine. I'll show the biochemistry here to you shortly. It can be elevated because of stress. And then you have to ask the question, what kind of stress? Because stress can come in many different forms. Most people's stress is mental, emotional based, but there can be physical stress. Physical stress could be chemicals, chronic infections, heavy metals, chronic illness of some sort. Okay, all of these things can cause a physiological change in the body that can be induced stress within the nervous system. The use of L-Dopa or certain herbs or supplements that elevate dopamine could increase Vanillic acid. The use of amino acids, phenylalanine and tyrosine, can also cause it to be high. Even certain heavy metals, lead toxicity, mercury, aluminum, and others can elevate dopamine. And it's thought that perhaps what's happening is they're causing damage in the nerve cell that's increasing the release of stored dopamine. And then the classic is Clostridia bacteria can elevate dopamine levels. Certain parasites like toxoplasmosis is known to elevate dopamine too, but more common is Clostridia bacteria, which tends to show up in about 20 to 25% of organic acid tests that you'll see. So let's look at the biochemistry. So if we orient ourselves here, we've got phenylalanine up top, we've got tyrosine, and then we've got the byproducts of Clostridia production, and that's our 4-creosol and our HPA. But in a normal fashion, phenylalanine can become tyrosine, which becomes dopa, which becomes dopamine. Okay, and then we have this enzyme, dopamine beta hydroxylase, which allows us to convert dopamine to norepinephrine, and then that norepinephrine can also become epinephrine or adrenaline. And what's being detected on the organic acid test are the metabolites, okay? HVA linked to dopamine, and then VMA linked primarily to norepinephrine, could be epinephrine too. So you have to start looking at this and say, well, what could elevate it and what could potentially decrease dopamine levels, for example? Well, we could increase dopamine levels by shoving more tyrosine into this pathway. That would cause it to elevate. We could block this enzyme, the dopamine beta hydroxylase. That would cause the dopamine levels to rise. We could also block the conversion of dopamine to HVA. That would also cause dopamine levels to elevate. If we were to block dopamine beta hydroxylase, or we were to increase tyrosine or even phenylalanine, or even things that stimulate dopa, that could cause the dopamine levels to elevate quite a bit. But if this pathway were open, that would also cause our Vanillic acid levels to elevate. So the elevated level of Vanillic acid doesn't tell you why it's elevated. It just tells you it is. So then you have to put on your clinical thinking hat and start to say, well, what are the possibilities here? And this is where you can start to reach back and look at other factors within the organic acid test, or perhaps looking at the clinical history of the person you're working with, the supplements that they're on, the medications that they're taking. And certainly genetics could also play a certain role in this as well. Now, Great Plains actually has a DNA methylation pathway profile. And these are, sophisticated tests that look at different genetic variants, what are called polymorphisms in these types of enzymes. And one of those that gets evaluated is something called COMT. Now, COMT stands for catechol O-methyltransferase. And this is an enzyme that deactivates or breaks down, if you will, various neurotransmitters. It can essentially break down dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. It could also have an effect on certain estrogens and even environmental chemicals that have what's called a catechol structure. But basically, in this particular discussion, let's just focus right now on dopamine. Okay, so dopamine gets converted to homovanillic acid through the actions of catecholamine methyltransferase. Vanillic acid can also be produced. It's the metabolite of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Again, COMT is the enzyme that makes that happen. And you can have polymorphisms or genetic variants that could alter the function of that enzyme. So expand this out and just take a look at a few things that could influence this. We kind of talked about this earlier, but let's go over this again. Here we've got, I'm going to change my color on my pen here. Let's do a blue color. So here is our dopamine, okay? And it naturally will get converted to norepinephrine through the actions of dopamine beta hydroxylase. And then we're going to have some of that gets converted or broken down into homovanillic acid by our COMT enzyme. So if we had, let's say, Clostridia bacteria, okay, Clostridia difficile, well, it produces a chemical called 4-creosol. 4-creosol is a known inhibitor of dopamine beta hydroxylase, the enzyme that converts dopamine to norepinephrine. So it causes an inhibition effect on dopamine beta hydroxylase. That's what this X is about. There's another chemical on the organic acid test called HPHPA. Now it's produced by different strains of Clostridia, and it too can inhibit dopamine beta hydroxylase. So either in the presence of 4-creosol or HPHPA, that can cause our dopamine levels to elevate. And you could see that with an elevation of homovanillic acid on the OAT test under the neurotransmitter section. Now, it turns out that there's also polymorphisms or genetic variants that exist within the dopamine beta hydroxylase. And I know that Great Plains is working on that test. I'm not sure exactly when that's coming out, but they are working on that test as a genetic test. And so if that's the case, that could alter the function of dopamine beta hydroxylase, and that could cause dopamine levels to elevate. And you might see that as an increase of homovanillic acid on the neurotransmitter section. If you're taking a lot of tyrosine amino acid or phenylalanine amino acid, you could potentially induce activity into the dopamine pathway, causing dopamine to elevate. That could also cause the HVA to go up. Okay, so all of those are variables. Now, what's interesting is if you actually had a polymorphism or an abnormal variant in the COMT enzyme, okay, that can alter the way dopamine gets converted to homovanillic acid. So the HVA levels may not be high or only slightly high, even in the presence of some of these other variables. Okay, and the only way to know that is to actually do the genetic testing. In this particular case, you certainly get elevations of dopamine, but you may not necessarily be seeing elevations of the HPA. So what happens if you have 2 or 3 of these factors going on? Let's say you've got high levels of creosol and you're taking a bunch of tyrosine, for example. We know we're getting an inhibition on dopamine beta hydroxylase. And let's just say, for example, that there's a polymorphism in that enzyme. Well, you would certainly expect to see high levels of dopamine accumulating over time, and you probably should also see high levels of homovanillic acid. These Clostridia bacteria produce, again, different toxins. A common one that Clostridia difficile produces is something called creosol. Creosol is also 4-creosol. Get a different pen. Okay, and it is a strong inhibitor of dopamine beta hydroxylase. So it inhibits that converting enzyme, which converts dopamine to norepinephrine. That particular toxin, the creosol, once it binds to the active site on the enzyme, okay, it's irreversible. So basically, it just renders whatever dopamine beta hydroxylase enzyme it attaches to worthless. Okay, it doesn't mean that every single dopamine beta hydroxylase enzyme in the body is being inactivated. In fact, I don't even know what the percentage is, but a certain amount of it gets altered. And that's whether it's in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. The neurotransmitter section from the organic acid test isn't just looking at neurotransmitters in the brain. It's looking at neurotransmitter, assessment throughout the body. And one of the reasons why it's important to avoid, amino acid supplementations that contain phenylalanine and tyrosine in the presence of Clostridia bacteria is because it can make the Clostridia bacteria worse. So here's an example of an individual that did an organic acid test. This individual had an early onset Parkinson's condition. And when we looked at the organic acid test under the Clostridia section, we saw some very high levels of 4-hydroxyphenylacetic acid, which is linked to C. difficile, and extremely high levels of 4-creosol, again linked to C. difficile. In fact, that level was one of the highest I've ever seen, 1157. So there's a really significant problem in Clostridia. The homovanillic acid level is extremely high. That's the highest I personally. So the question is why? Well, it turns out that when we analyzed the supplements the person was on, they were taking an herb called mucuna, which is known to stimulate L-DOPA, okay, L-DOPA becoming dopamine. They were taking tyrosine powder, okay, tyrosine powder becomes L-DOPA, which becomes dopamine. They were also taking a combination supplement that had a bunch of tyrosine in it. And so what was happening is the Clostridia is using the tyrosine to produce for creosol. The Clostridia numbers are rising, the 4-creosol numbers are rising. We're getting inhibition of dopamine beta hydroxylase, which is causing an increase in dopamine, which is causing an increase in the metabolite homovanillic acid. Too much dopamine in the nervous system is a problem because it's a very reactive chemical. About 90% of dopamine is stored in what's called terminal vesicles in the neuron or the nerve cell, but about 10% of it is sitting out in the cytosolic fluid, and small percentage shifts in that percentage that 10%, is enough to induce a toxic effect. In fact, one of the major effects of dopamine toxicity is the thought that it depletes the biome. Also, elevated dopamine can infiltrate the autonomic nervous system, overstimulating the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, okay, that drives stress. And I talked earlier in this lecture that stress is also an inducer of dopamine. Stress can also be an inducer of epinephrine and epinephrine that you might see. So it's an inducer of adrenaline. But again, too much adrenaline is bad because it burns out the body. Too much stimulation of the adrenal system, which is where these things are linked to, causes too much cortisol production, which is a catabolic hormone. It's fine in small amounts, but problematic long-term. And so it just creates long-term imbalances in the body. So dopamine, and the fight or flight, infiltrate the autonomic nervous system, cause oxidative damage, and deplete glutathione. Question to ask is, well, what does a depletion of glutathione do? Well, glutathione is the very powerful antioxidant that we need to protect our cells against oxidative stress. It helps with detoxification in the cell. It also helps protect our mitochondria. And our mitochondria are the energy factories of our cells that produce the chemical currency ATP that runs our brain, our nervous system, our immune system, our gut, our hormone system, etc. What ends up happening with excess dopamine is dopamine breaks down into something called dopamine-O-quinone. And dopamine-O-quinone is seen in the body as a toxin, and it attempts to neutralize it with glutathione. Okay, so we create these compounds where we've got glutathione linking up with dopamine-O-quinone. But over time, that might cause glutathione levels. And that's not good because the depletion of glutathione then sets us up for other problems elsewhere in the body. Dopamine-O-quinone is directly damaging to brain cells. Dopamine-O-quinone can generate a lot of free radical damage, which can cause neurodegeneration, manifesting in many different types of chronic neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis, etc. What about the VMA, vanillyl acid? Let's look at that. Metabolite of norepinephrine and epinephrine. It can also be elevated because of stress. And if you follow the biochemistry around, it could be elevated again because of some of the same things that elevate dopamine: L-dopa, phenylalanine, tyrosine use, heavy metals. It could be elevated too with a spillover effect of, again, too much dopamine. And let's see. Also, breakdown enzymes could be a problem too. So are converting enzymes. So here we've got tyrosine, okay, converting to dopa, converting to dopamine, and then we've got a conversion to norepinephrine to epinephrine. By the way, Clostridia bacteria is not going to cause an elevation of VMA, okay, particularly if that dopamine beta hydroxylase enzyme is getting inhibited. It depends on how much inhibition is happening. It depends on when you do the test. It's possible that in the presence of Clostridia, in the very early stages, that where that enzyme is being inhibited or partially inhibited, you're getting, excess dopamine being produced that could cause a stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. You could get production of epinephrine that way. It's all a little bit of a spectrum here, but in advanced cases, if that dopamine beta hydroxylase enzyme is getting shut down significantly, a Clostridia bacteria is typically you're not going to see high VMA. You're going to either see normal or low. So I'm just going to scratch this off. My eyes didn't pick that up early on. Okay, so let's kind of go through that scenario I just talked about. So if everything is, let's say, functioning normally, so if you take phenylalanine and it gets converted to tyrosine, and that tyrosine gets converted to dopa, and that dopa gets converted to dopamine, and we've got good activity of dopamine beta hydroxylase that converts over, and we get good conversion to epinephrine, that mechanism could cause elevation of VMA. We also get production of epinephrine from the adrenal glands. Okay, so an increase of epinephrine through adrenal activity because of stress through the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis could also cause the vanillic acid levels to go up. And as I mentioned before, in the presence of, let's say, Clostridia bacteria that's producing either HPA or creosol, and that's causing an inhibition of dopamine beta hydroxylase, you typically would not see an elevation of VMA. Now, a back-ended way where VMA might go up in that scenario is if we're getting high levels of dopamine, okay, and that dopamine is now infiltrating into the sympathetic nervous system, triggering a fight or flight response, and that fight or flight response is now getting activated through the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and the adrenal glands are getting stimulated via this route, that might cause that VMA marker to go up. So you got to understand the mechanism and the fact that this is not just a linear approach. There's other things that might be triggering stress in the body, and too much dopamine is one of those factors that can stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. That could cause VMA levels to go up. If you had, let's say, a polymorphism in dopamine beta hydroxylase, okay, where the function of that enzyme is compromised, it's slowed down a bit, that might affect norepinephrine and epinephrine. It might be possible to sort of move past that polymorphism by, increasing the amounts of tyrosine or phenylalanine, or supporting that particular enzyme with certain cofactors like vitamin C and copper. So again, it's not an all or none phenomena in some of these particular cases. It's not to sit there and say that in every single case where you've got the presence of 4-creosol or Clostridia that you're always automatically going to see low VMA. That may not be happening. What's important from this is to come away and to understand that this is a multi-layer system that has a lot of different tentacles that move off in different directions, and so different things can get influenced by different areas. So what could cause low VMA? Well, a couple scenarios would be purely stated before. You might see low VMA if you got Clostridia. Okay, that's inhibiting that enzyme and not allowing dopamine to convert. That might cause VMA in that scenario. You could also have a polymorphism in your COMT, okay, where we're not able to convert epinephrine and norepinephrine to VMA. That might cause the VMA levels to go down. Theoretically, if you were really deficient in some of these amino acids, that might be enough to cause a low VMA. If you were very deficient in, let's say, vitamin C or copper, which, by the way, these two, this vitamin and mineral is a cofactor for dopamine beta hydroxylase. If these were deficient, that might cause your VMA levels to go down too. Okay, so COMT, the catecholamine methyltransferase, is what converts epinephrine and norepinephrine to VMA. But again, if you had, let's say, a polymorphism here, some kind of block, that might prevent that from happening. In these particular cases, you might see a low VMA. And then there's another level to this whole discussion, to take it, again, to a deeper layer. And that's the link between all of this and the methylation cycle. There's so much attention focused on the methylation cycle, and for good reason. It's a big deal. And then we have a lot of attention focused on what's called the folate cycle. And then for good reason, people are running out, checking their MTHFR. Okay, looking at polymorphisms in MTHFR. But most of the time it's being related to folate status or how that might affect methylation. But there's another side of this, and that is what's called the Biopteryn cycle, or BH4 to BH2 cycle. And this isn't discussed as much, but it has a significant impact on neurotransmitter metabolism, because it can also impact L-DOPA, tyrosine, phenylalanine, tryptophane, and serotonin. Tryptophane is converted to 5-hydroxytryptophane through the actions of what's called BH4, tetrahydrobiopterin. Let's just call it BH4. So BH4 is what is utilized as a cofactor through tryptophane hydroxylase. So tryptophane hydroxylase, okay, converts tryptophane to 5-hydroxytryptophane. That has an impact on serotonin. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Tyrosine is converted to L-DOPA through tyrosine hydroxylase. Phenylalanine is converted to tyrosine through phenylalanine hydroxylase. They both, all three of these, use BH4. So in the discussion of dopamine, for example, we've got BH4 up here. That's what helps convert phenylalanine to tyrosine, and then tyrosine to dopamine, or L-DOPA, or DOPA. If you follow this out, okay, we get a lot of phenylalanine from dietary protein. It can be taken as a supplement. And we need to be able to convert properly phenylalanine to tyrosine through the actions of BH4. Okay, so our body needs to be making BH4 in order for that to happen. It's a precursor to L-DOPA, which is a precursor to dopamine. It turns out that tyrosine is also a precursor to melanin, for pigment in the skin. It's a precursor to CoQ10, which is active in the mitochondria. It's a precursor to thyroid hormone, and it has other enzyme effects as well. On the organic acid test, there's actually a couple markers, phenylpyruvic and phenylactic, that can be elevated either in the presence of too much dope phenylalanine amino acid or some kind of block in the conversion of phenylalanine to tyrosine. So if there is a defect in the phenylalanine hydroxylase enzyme, or a deficiency, for example, of BH4, that could be occurring because of some sort of defect in the methylation or folate cycle, that might cause a buildup of phenylalanine, a decrease of tyrosine, which would ultimately cause what? A decrease in dopamine, and you would see increases of phenolactic acid and phenylpyruvic acid on the organic acid test. Now, children who often have this problem, a lot of times, a couple things show up. Some in really serious situations, you can get, serious neurological problems, mental retardation, tremors, microcephaly, seizure disorders, and then hypopigmentation. So light skin, blue eyes, for example, because of a decrease in melanin. So think about all the things that tyrosine supports. Okay, it helps with skin pigmentation. It helps with catecholamine production, which is basically dopamine, norepinephrine. We talked about that. Okay, and some kind of a block, in order for that to happen, can be, causing, all of these issues over here. By the way, this is interesting. Fumarate acetoacetate, that fits right into our mitochondria. So what are some clinical suspicions for poor BH4 support? Okay, well, low thyroid possibly, because tyrosine is needed to help support T4 and T3 production. Low energy because of mitochondrial support, focus problems, pale skin, low dopamine, low norepinephrine, low serotonin on the organic acid test. So that's a possibility that that's what's happening when you see an organic acid test and you've got low values for all of these neurotransmitters. So let's focus a little on tryptophane metabolites, okay? Looking specifically at 5-hydroxyindoleacetic acid. Now I mentioned before, you might see, not very common, but you might see, sometimes elevated levels of 5-HAA. Most commonly, it occurs from food source or tryptophan use or 5-HTP use. Make sure to read the interpretive guide. More commonly, it's low. Okay, so we know that tryptophane can be converted to 5-HTP or 5-hydroxytryptophan through the actions of BH4. But this tryptophane hydroxylase enzyme, which makes that happen, is very interesting. Okay, because it turns out that tryptophane hydroxylase is a vitamin D dependent enzyme. There's actually a receptor element, or what's called a response element, linked to the function of that enzyme that is linked to the status of vitamin D. And there's two different types of tryptophane hydroxylase. There's tryptophane hydroxylase 1 and tryptophase hydroxylase 2. 1 is most active in the digestive system. 2 is most active in the brain and central nervous system. What happens is that when the vitamin D level is deficient, it causes the activity of tryptophase hydroxylase 1 to go up. So you're getting more serotonin production in the digestive system and less in the brain. And when the tryptophane or the vitamin D levels are more in a normal level, we get a downregulation of the digestive system tryptophane hydroxylase and an increased activity of the brain and nervous system type of tryptophane hydroxylase. So another way of thinking of it is being vitamin D deficient could increase your susceptibility to being low or depleted in serotonin within the brain and nervous system. So it could be a contributing factor to low brain serotonin and sleep problems and depression and anxiety, etc. Another enzyme that has an effect on serotonin is our monoamine oxidase A. Okay, and it's what's involved in, metabolizing serotonin appropriately in order for us to have, adequate levels of this 5-hydroxyindoleacetic acid. So the story really begins with tryptophane, because tryptophane is needed to help produce serotonin, but tryptophane also can go and produce something called quinolinic acid. Now, quinolinic acid has some biochemical support in the body, but too much of it can become an excitotoxic neurotransmitter. Both quinolinic acid and our 5-HAA are measured off the organic acid test. Various amino acids, what are called neutral amino acids, will compete with tryptophane's entry into the brain. So the body attempts to keep these, amino acids fairly regulated, but in high protein meals or taking, high amounts of protein powder, over a prolonged period of time, might, and I say might, doesn't automatically mean it happens, but could compromise serotonin levels because of a competitive inhibition effect. Only small amounts of tryptophan actually cross the blood-brain barrier, okay, which makes it vulnerable, somebody vulnerable to become deficient in serotonin. Okay, so here we have these competition from these large neutral amino acids. We know it can block tryptophan's passage through the blood-brain barrier. And one of the things that actually aids the transport of tryptophane across the blood-brain barrier is carbohydrates, because high carbohydrate diets stimulate insulin, leading to a lowering of these branched chain amino acids, and then less competition for tryptophane to enter the brain. Now, quinolinic acid is another chemical on the neurotransmitter section that's important to look out for, particularly in an elevated state, because when it's elevated, it has the potential to become neurotoxic. So let me orient you to this slide. Up at the upper left-hand corner, we've got tryptophane. Right down here at the lower left corner, we've got quinolinic acid. Now, quinolinic acid biochemically has a supportive role for aiding in the production of a chemical called NAD, which is called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It is a cofactor in many enzymatic reactions in the body, excuse me, including the mitochondria. We know that tryptophane can get converted to serotonin, and it needs the activity of tryptophane hydroxylase. We need good vitamin D status as well as BH4 to make that happen in the presence of different stressors. Okay, cortisol, interferon, chronic infections can all increase the activity of this enzyme called indoleamine 2,3 dioxygenase. Increases in IDO, which is what the acronym for this enzyme is, increases in IDO enzyme will cause tryptophane to move away from the serotonin pathway and enter what's called the quinolinic pathway. And ultimately, we end up at the level of quinolinic acid, or we can end up there. Now, again, that might have a supportive role for NAD production, which can help with energy production and other enzymes. But too much quinolinic acid becomes a problem. So too much of a good thing now becomes a bad thing. Because quinolinic acid is what's called an NMDA receptor agonist. It becomes a potent neurotoxin and has been linked to many different types of chronic neurological, degenerative disorders, psychiatric disorders, suicidal ideation, body pain, etc. This is an image of an NMDA receptor, or what's also called a glutamate receptor. It gets stimulated, allows for calcium, sodium to flood into the cell. That has a triggering event on intercellular activity, but too much of it can be a problem because it can actually lead to a breakdown of cellular structures, inflammation, oxidative stress. It can start to damage the inside of the cell membranes, can damage the DNA, and in some cases lead to cell death, which is called apoptosis. And there's many different types of health conditions linked to this. This is one particular slide that's linked to the effects of quinolinic acid and treatment-resistant depression. As well as suicidal behaviors as well. And so from a larger discussion here, we could go into a much deeper layer, but this is one of the reasons why a lot of times using tryptophane supplements could be problematic, is because the tryptophane itself is now vulnerable to become quinolinic acid. But 5-HTP supplementation is not. Because biochemically, once the tryptophane becomes 5-hydroxytryptophan, or that's our 5-HTP, it's biochemically committed. Okay, it cannot go backwards. Okay, so 5-hydroxytryptophan does not get reconverted to tryptophan. So expand that out. What are some things that can cause stress in the body? Okay, that could affect the enzyme that makes quinolinic acid. Well, stress, cortisol for one, chronic infections, that could be virus, that could be bacteria, that could be fungal, could be parasitic. So usually it's a safer bet to use 5-HTP over tryptophan. Now, I'm not saying that tryptophan is, should be off the list of potentials to use. There's certain people that get benefit. But my rule is, and this is one of the reasons I do these to the organic acid test, is I want to make sure somebody doesn't have a chronic infection or that they don't already have elevated levels of quinolinic acid. And because in the cases, using tryptophan would not be, or usually is not, a good idea. And then there's this other marker, kynorenic. You very rarely see it out of balance. But it's part of this kynorenic quinolinic acid pathway as well. Now, if you do see it elevated, it's most likely going to be elevated because of the same things that are inducing an elevation of quinolinic acid, which is these guys right here. So whatever is increasing the activity of IDO could potentially be increasing kynorenic acid along with quinolinic acid, although I've seen a few cases where the kynorenic was high and the quinolinic was normal. But chronic infections and tryptophan use, for example. Now, the other thing about all of this is we could take this down even to a deeper level from a genetic standpoint. It's possible to have polymorphisms in all of these. That could be affecting some of these systems as well. I haven't gotten into some of the discussions on certain tumors that might be producing too much serotonin, for example, or a condition called gosh, I'm sorry, my mind's blanking. Pheochromocytoma, which can be producing too much, adrenaline in the body. That could be causing levels of VMA to go up. But those are relatively rare. Okay, what's most common and what you typically see in practice is things that we've talked about, where you've either got some kind of imbalance happening, okay, nutritionally. You've got the issue of chronic infections that are present. We've got somebody who's got a lot of mental, emotional stress, physical stress that's driving adrenaline levels up. They may have some kind of methylation imbalance. There could be some genetic variants there that are influencing the function of these enzymes. Certain medications that they might be taking, you know, let's say they're a patient obviously with Parkinson's disease is taking medication. All of those things could be affecting these neurochemicals. So you have to also do, you know, a clinical intake and look at supplements and see what other factors may be happening. So in reality, the neurotransmitter section is not a section on the oat that you can really look at in isolation. You have to be able to bridge the gap and start looking at what other factors might be influencing it. And that takes time. And you know, it takes training. It just takes time and practice to kind of start putting the pieces together. So get used to looking at the interpretive guides for the organic acids test. If you actually go to greatplainslaboratory.com and go under the organic acid test section, there is a document called the Clinical Significance of the Organic Acid Test. And it has all of the test marker interpretations. So if you see a marker on there, go read about it. If you have questions, you can always contact Great Plains directly and set up, you know, a time for consultation. And you're more than welcome to attend one of the organic acid test workshops that we have. I've been teaching these now for Great Plains for a number of years. They're all over the country. So you can, you know, constantly check in with Great Plains to see when a new workshop may be coming to your particular area. We created Integrative Medicine Academy about 3 years ago to provide different training courses for healthcare practitioners working with integrative and functional medicine. The first course we launched was Autism Mastery, which was an area of specialty for me now over the past 20 years. We've got a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth course, SIBO course. We have a Toxicity Mastery course. Looks like the formatting got screwed up there. Mastery course. And in all of these courses, we talk a lot about the organic acid test. So for example, the Toxicity Mastery course, I talk about how the organic acid test can link to certain environmental chemicals and mold toxicity. In SIBO, we look a lot at Clostridia invasive candida and other factors. The autism course, we talk about all of it. But in reality, any of these courses, we get into the organic acid test very in depth, along with many of the other tests that Great Plains provides in other scenarios. If you're interested in autism intervention and biomedical intervention, this Autism Mastery course is very, very comprehensive. In fact, we have a course starting again for Autism Mastery coming up next month towards the end of April. For more information, you can go to autismmasterycourse.com, or you can email to autismmasterycourse@gmail.com. I'm currently towards the end of our recent version of the Toxicity Mastery course, which we talk about mold toxins, chemical toxins, glyphosate, heavy metals, organic acid testing, detoxification, sauna therapy, and a bunch of other things. We will be rerunning this course again in a few months. I don't have the exact dates, but you can go to Toxicity Mastery course for more information. And then, of course, you can always access the recorded version of the course as well. And then our newest course that we just launched is Functional Medicine Mastery course. This is a 12-module course that is really meant to reinforce the basic concepts of functional medicine looking at specific testing, looking at supplementation, how the digestive system links up to the brain and nervous system, how the adrenal system becomes influenced by different types of chronic stressors, blood chemistry analysis, lab analysis. We are talking about the organic acid test in this course as well. This course just started, and this is a fantastic course as a general overview of functional medicine. So for more information about the functional medicine course, and people are still welcome to join, you can go to Functional Medicine masterycourse.com. If you have any questions, you can email to functionalmedicinecourse@gmail.com. There's also a website called Lab Test Plus that provides access to some of the tests that Great Plains has, as well as other labs. Each test that's ordered through Lab Test Plus comes with a written interpretation of the relevant findings and markers, along with what's called action step suggestions. So you can go to labtestplus.com to get more of a complete list of labs available. Any questions, you can email to labtestplus@gmail.com. And I'm always available for private consultations. I do phone, in-person, as well as internet-based consults. For more information about my private consults, you can contact us at that email, scmedicalcenter@gmail.com, or call 951-461-4800. Okay, everybody, I appreciate your attendance. I realize this is can be a confusing topic. I think it's interesting. It's been a while. I've wanted to talk about some of these things and get into this particular section of the test. As you can see, it's a multi-layer approach. There's a lot more information we could get into. So what I really did was try and touch on some of the common reasons of why you might see elevations of HVA, VMA, and the 5-HAA, and why you might also see low values of those markers as well. I don't know why that happened. So again, everybody have a nice day. This is Dr. Kurt Wohler for Great Plains Lab. Take care.